Hello and welcome to Nailing It Down, a Varm blog supplement. And today we're going to be talking about Kluge, or Kludge. Now, I first became enamored with the concept of Kluge in 2008. I was uh, reading a bunch of neuroscience texts to try to deal with improving educational efficiency in my part of the Deep South and the exurban South. And I was very frustrated with educational research. I had begun doing research on the methodologies of educational research and the kind of myths of educational research, and I discovered some very frustrating things, um, like that learning styles were really learning preferences, that the research on learning styles was never robust, that the APA, the American Psychological Association, had not corrected various educational publications on it because they thought that the effects of learning style pedagogy were good enough that even though there wasn't evidence for it, that it was a tolerable kind of myth. There are still hundreds of papers written on learning styles every day. I can go to district after district training across the United States. I've been to charter schools who talk about it in Mexico, Egypt, Taiwan. They're not real. All right, it's been thoroughly debunked. It's been thoroughly debunked now for about a decade. It is just now being debunked amongst teachers. So I was interested in this idea of neurologically informed education. Now, that's also a problem, and maybe a problem for a different time, because a lot of the research in neurology in regards to application and education is still not also particularly robust, and the mechanisms are not really understood. But I was desperate. I was a young teacher. I wanted to make my class more interesting for a bunch of poor students. I also taught students with neurodivergence, various special education issues, learning disabilities, behavioral disorders, chronic poverty, racial animus, etc. And so I was just trying to dig into both the neurological literature and the sociological literature. And I began looking at very interesting systems views of mind functioning and the epiphenomenon. For those of you who don't know, a phenomenon is a something that something does explicitly, and an epiphenomenon is kind of an accidental development from what is done explicitly. And so there's two books on this. There's Gary Marcus's Kluge, The Haphazard Construction of the Human Mind, which is what I read, and David Linden's The Accidental Mind, how the brain evolution has given us love, memory, dreams, and God, from 2007. I began to discover that Kluge was actually a word from aerospace engineering in the military. Its origins are actually quite obscure, and it has many possible etymologies, and I can talk about them because this is going to help you figure out some reasoning problems with etymological thinking. So Kludge, or Kluge, is really mentioned first in a 1962 article by Jackson W. Grisholm in the American computer magazine Datamation. So this is early computer science. And Grisham's definition, or Granholm's definition, not Grisham, is an ill-assorted collection of poorly matching parts forming a distressing whole. In computing, a machine or system or program that has been improvised or botched together, a hastily improvised or poorly thought out solution to a fault or bug. Now, this word may have many origins. American Yiddish speakers use Kluge to mean too smart by half or overly clever. It is related to the German word for clever. I mean, it's literally Yiddish borrowing from German. It has other Germanic roots. So like Klus or Clod, meaning, a clod, a loose conglomeration is how we'd say it in English. In Low Saxon and Dutch, Klud, which is where we get the word clot from in English, and Kluge, which is like a dumpling, and specifically in Jutland dialect Danish, Kleit can mean piece of bad workmanship, and then in standard Danish it's related to the word kludder, which sounds like what clutter in English is, again from Low Saxon, a mess or disorder. Now, all those sound like they could be the origins of this term, but here's the problem. There's another hypothesis that says the word Kluge actually is from a paper feeder error in 1907, when two machinists built a paper feeder to print out, a stuff from just various pieces, kind of adding and adding on without re-engineering anything. And the people who worked on this was Abel and Inevol Kluge. All right. So something that is temperamental, easy breakdown, overly complicated, but clever. Now, according to the New Hacker's Dictionary and the jargon file, there is Kludge and Kluge actually have developed different usages in hacking circles, because computer coders is where this went next. So you have this in aerospace engineering, which is where it first emerges in the 60s. It may be related to other forms of engineering. And then you have it show up in this idea of writing code inelegantly, so you don't have to rewrite code, you just tack on new code pieces. All right. So Kludge is a poorly made tack on. It's used to get around a problem, and you're going to have to fix it later, but it's not very good. And a Kluge is more of a Rube Goldberg device. It's clever, and it's intended to solve a nasty expedient, but it adds complexity to the code. And sometimes it may even work for the wrong reason. You don't really understand why the code is producing what you want it to do, so you can't really replicate it. So I kludge this routine and get around a weird bug, right? That's the example. Now, I discovered this after reading the evolutionary neuroscience books that I talked about. And one of the things they talk about is a lot of developments in evolutionary development. So the human eye, for example, the retina's backwards. That doesn't really make sense. There's all kinds of inelegant biological things. There's all kinds of what you call genetic baggage, or human tendencies for things such as pareidolia that develop because we have cognition patterns that can be expressed in various cultural ways, but will trigger certain things, and they're very useful, but they don't get evolved out. Now, I want to point out all this. This is on shaky grounds because these are extrapolations from evolutionary science and evolutionary neurology. They aren't proven. But what we do know is, like, we have an overly complex genetic code with a lot of genes that have epigenetic and genetic effects and triggering effects that don't seem to be necessarily beneficial for the organism or even the species, but are just there and interact with each other in complicated and unpredictable ways. And they developed over time. So the idea in biology was related to the idea that you're fixing things kind of ad hoc. Now, over time, Kluge began to be used by people like me, frankly, in reference to complexity. So, what we mean by Kluge and complexity theory is any engineering where you have something built and you put effort into building it and you need to fix an immediate problem. And you cleverly tack on something to fix the problem. But in doing so, you add more parts for breakdown, more parts for cascade failure, that something can trip the whole system into failing. And instead of redesigning the system from the ground up because the cost of taking it out is too high, you just add on to it. And what this does is it makes it almost impossible to know how the machine functions. And when it breaks down, harder to fix, because sometimes some things work for reasons that you didn't mean, or maybe it has longer effects that are positive, but at a cost of other things that are negative, and eventually this leads to breakdown. Now, when you think about this in terms of complexity theory and systems theory, what that means is you accumulate more and more dead weight to whatever you're doing, whether it's a social formation, a evolutionary development in the brain, a machine that's increasingly Rube Goldberged. All of these things are Kluges because they all basically try to fix a problem with a smart answer that doesn't re-engineer anything, because the cost of re-engineering it, of taking the old infrastructure or the biological development up and really making it optimized to work in a clean, consistent way, is actually higher than just temporarily fixing it. The problem with kludges is they have knock-on effects that are unpredictable because they're not designed for elegant capacity. Now, one of the interesting things about evolution is in some sense, almost everything that we develop is a kludge, meaning that there's a reason, for example, like we all, like according to the theory, we all develop bilateral symmetry, that we basically have only so many structures that mammals or even animals can do, that the more complicated an organism is, the more likely you are to have convergent evolution that produces the same thing over and over and over again to fill a complicated biological niche. But these are all accidents. They're epiphenomenons of just surviving and perpetuating your genes, right? And since many of these things are not positive or negative, or they might become positive at a later date or negative at a later date because of a later interaction, they're Kluges. But when we talk about Kluges in society, I mean something like take the water system in Atlanta. The water system in Atlanta is a system that's highly inefficient, based on very old lead pipes that have been built on by PVC pipes and other things, because the infrastructure was built early on and it was just built on top of other infrastructure. It was buried to get it out of the way, and pulling it up is so costly that actually fixing the problem is too hard. So you continually patch it and patch it and patch it, but that actually creates more fracture points, more points for breakage, more loss, more leakage, etc. This concept of kludge then is crucial to, say, Joseph Tainter, even though he doesn't use this term, because a complex society doesn't become elegantly designed. It adds things ad hoc and subtracts things ad hoc. And sometimes it can't subtract things socially for whatever reason. Now, this is kind of a metaphor, but it's not entirely. There's, in some way, this is literal. Like, we have these rules that we tack on. They create path dependencies. These path dependencies get more complicated. Instead of fixing the primary rule, we kludge them. In American law, This is why we've relied on Supreme Court rulings rather than amendments and redesigning the Constitution to fix developments of the country since the mid 1960s, basically, and the partisan ideological sorting of the two capitalist parties. All right. Now, it's important to remember here that this is a system description that is partly metaphorical and partly literal. And I'm going to talk about some other things. I'm going to talk about logical positivism, what I like about it, what I dislike about it, why I get so frustrated when we talk with abstract sometimes without limiting where the abstract actually fits in and what our criteria is and all that, because these are also kind of Kluge in the way they actually work. All right. They attach things and they have knock-on effects and path dependencies that we don't see. Now, what does this have to do with socialism and Marxism? Well, the problem that we have is a problem of old wine and new wine skins. For those of you who don't know your biblical metaphor, I think this metaphor is particularly illustrative. In the biblical metaphor, the air bubbles of the wine expand the wineskin. It grows to what you need for the wine, right? And that's from the fermentation process. It's breathable. You drink your wine though, and if you pour new wine in there, the bubbles in the wine are going to completely expand again. But you've already probably reached tactile elasticity in the leather of the wineskin, and it just burst. Which is why you can't reuse wineskins, but you can reuse water skins. All right. That's the metaphor. It's often lost on people because we don't know how the ancient world works, right? But that's kind of why when we talk about revolutionary change versus slow evolutionary change, it's because we have to deal with the Kluge problem. But you can't ever totally deal with it. There are always residual pieces of the prior society in the new one, and this is in Marx too. Right? This is a Gordian knot that you can cut down, but you can't completely cut apart. You can't totally get rid of it. So this is just to give you how I started using the term. People have been asking me, well, where does this show up in Norbert Wiener or Stanford Beer or even someone like Michel Delanda in cybernetic theory or systems theory? I'm like, it doesn't. All right. This actually shows up in evolutionary psychology and systems of evolution, and it's a metaphor from. Well, it's a analogous concept. It's not really a metaphor, because in some ways they do mean it literally. Like, we're not designed; these are epiphenomenal things that happen and happen to be advantageous in evolutionary theory, which is why they stay. No one's designing a person, so there's no way for it not to be a Kluge, right? But the problem is infinite complexity. You can't really simplify this. Like, if we tried to simplify our genetics, we have no idea what parts of the quote evolutionary baggage or junk DNA actually have significant effects, because they're not isolated and they work in complicated ways with environmental and epigenetic triggers and everything else. A Marxist should be humble, but should actually be up on science, and probably shouldn't be basing all their ideas on what science is and isn't off of things from the 19th century, right? And this is one of those areas where this is clarifying. We live in a society that is infinitely complex, and that is often just engineered, literally and metaphorically, workarounds to key problems that we really needed to redesign whole parts of the system for. And while sometimes it produces the desired results, over time it makes the system more and more complex, harder and harder to fix, and thus you start hitting over complexity, becoming an energy loss in the literal sense. It takes too much energy to maintain the system, and it increases entropy and decay, and everything falls apart. You hit over complexity. Right? Kluges are the literal manifestation of that, where you fix a problem in a quick, clever way that makes every bit of it more complicated instead of redesigning the parts you need to redesign. And that is a system idea, because even in engineering, Engineering is a system, all right? It is the way things relate, physical things relate to each other and produce predictable results. It's not a biological system, it's a simple system. Like a biological system or a sociological system, which is a biological system that interacts with itself in a kind of way, is infinitely complex, right? Just think about it. Think about how complex it would be. You know, how many sciences go into sociology? Well, all of them, including physics. But you can't make sociology like physics because physics is about the simplest particles in the universe, which tend to be way more complex than we thought, and just amplify that in orders of complexity almost infinitely. Man creates their own world, but not of their own choosing, right? That's not the exact quote, but that's what it means. But history weighs upon it. How we built stuff in the past, how we accumulated things, the cultures of technology, the path-dependent patterns are not easily reversible. We've often just fixed them by little ad hoc clever additions, but do not address the root of the problem. And radical, the word means to get to the root, right? Not to klug around things. We want to look at the systems and see where we have to start rebuilding in an elegant way instead of an inelegant one. And that is the difference between reformism and something more systemically radical. But maybe the cost of being that systemically radical is too much. Maybe the system is too complicated. That is something in each case you have to figure out, which is why it is never, reform or klug or elegance, but usually a mixture of both. All right. I hope this makes why I use this concept more clear, what the purpose is, its history, and also illustrates some kinds of reasoning for you. Have a great day. Like and subscribe. Hit the bell if you want more. Go check out the podcast on Budsprout. And if you really want to support us, subscribe. You'll get everything in audio form, including the Nailing It Downs. You'll get Diving into the Wreckage, which is also available to Antifada subscribers. You'll get Parallax Vlog, which is also available to JG Michaels subscribers. You will get Gaming Materialist for free, but you get it now. You'll get my other stuff with JR. There's other projects down the pipeline, but it's going to take a little while because I'm focusing on my day job. Thank you so much. For those of you who've been a little bit overwhelmed with the number of things I've been releasing, I've gone back to doing my day job because it's my season of rest is over and I can't rest mentally. So I'm always producing something or reading something. So it will slow down. But we have some big projects in the works that I think you're going to like that are very much aimed at clarifying various concepts. I think we have a big thing because people think, for example, that I don't take the national question seriously. I think I'll be working with Gene Bajalan. This is literally his area of specialty, and we're going to go through the various Marxist, non-Marxist, historical, academic, the problems of the national problem and why it's not an easy question and why you can't hand wave it away, but also why we haven't found a good fix for it either. And then if why it's important to things like the idea of race and everything else. These are all crucial questions, and we hope to shed some light on them from our perspective in a rigorous way, not in a guru ideological way, right? Which is what a lot of I don't want to be the Marxist IDW, right? And we're going to question some of our own assumptions, but put it in the context of anthropology, of the development of socialist politics, of the different criterions, the different patterns of developments in different areas of the world. It's going to be a very complicated thing. There's going to be lots of reading, lots of book suggestions. And Gene and I are going to try to really tackle a question. And so people who think I just don't take the national question seriously, you will be corrected. But thank you for pointing that out in the comments. A lot of the antagonistic comments actually are generative even when I'm bitchy to you in the comment stream, it's often useful for me to kind of spar with you to figure out where maybe I'm not communicating something, or where there's a weakness, or where you assume one of my guests' opinion is mine because I didn't push back hard enough or something like that. And so please do it. It also helps the algorithm, but that's not the biggest thing that's driving me. This is an educational effort. And I would like to thank my supporters. You have really enabled me, and you're going to enable me to probably travel to LA and hang out with TIR at a show in October. So if you're one of our California listeners, particularly in Southern California, and you want to come out and meet me, even if I'm not on the stage, I will be there. I believe I'm going to start talking about setting it up and driving down there soon. And so come out and meet me then. All right. Love to you all, even though I've been accused of negging my audience. Have a great day. Peace.